And these were considered very shocking at the time. And I can't remember whether it was true, but supposedly the rumor goes that when Ronald Reagan showed up for the Olympics, he was then president, that they were concealed in order not to offend, and that when the photograph was taken for them to appear on a stamp, they were slightly turned so the naughty bits weren't too much in evidence. So this is not altogether new, and to that end, to talk about some of the legal principles and some of the pressures that are going back and forth is Alonzo Wickers IV, who is a partner at Davis, Wright, and Tremaine, and whose clients, in the interest of the First Amendment, have ranged from the OC Weekly to Comedy Central. Take it away.
Thank you. One of the challenges is that the First Amendment has really grew a lot during the 20th century. So when Siqueiros painted these murals back in 1932, the notion of what kind of protections there were under the First Amendment were very, very different than they were today. And I don't think anybody in 1932 would have believed that the First Amendment gave any protection at all for those murals. So if you kind of fast forward, it was really during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that we had really great strides ahead in First Amendment law that recognized that the First Amendment doesn't just protect political speech, it protects motion pictures and visual arts like the mural here. And so I think that what really happened is that we now recognize there is strong First Amendment protection for works like that. The challenge is that what the court's done over the last 15 or 20 years with respect to public funding of the arts, they've said there's no First Amendment requirement that the government fund art. But if the government does fund art, it can't discriminate based on content. So it creates kind of a perverse result, because in many instances, you have cities and counties, especially in less progressive parts of the country, that have simply backed off and said, we're not going to pay for any public art because we don't want to have the naughty bit shown. We don't want the local community theater to put on a Terrence McNally play or something like that. And you end up with absolutely no public funding of the arts. And that's permitted under the First Amendment. So that's really kind of the challenge, I think, that we have today, is walking that fine line. Because once the government does start to fund public art, then it's much more difficult for the government to have any say over the content. You recall the Brooklyn Museum of Art.
Andres Serrano exhibition?
The Chris O'Feely, the dung-covered Virgin Mary painting that Mayor Giuliani and the Catholic League took such great offense at back in New York in 1998. Mayor Giuliani said, either remove this piece from the Sensation exhibition, or we are not paying any more money to the museum. And the city of New York also owned the building and said, we will terminate your lease next month if you don't remove the piece of art. And the museum went to court and was successful at the cost of legal fees of over $1 million, though, at winning the right to show this Chris O'Feely piece. And the court was very firm in saying the city cannot terminate the museum's lease, cannot cut off public funding simply because the mayor does not like a particular piece of art. And so there are strong protections once.
He did like the dogs playing poker, though.
It's the upshot. The good side of that is I believe that was the second most successful exhibition in the history of the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So in some ways, even though it cost the museum a lot of money, on one hand, the museum did manage to grab a lot of good press from that case. I think that's often what happens when you have controversies surrounding art. It's what maybe, like we're talking about the Watts Towers, we don't always go and see the things that are in our backyard that we should all go see, but all of a sudden if there's a controversy around them, it might actually give us that extra incentive to get out there and see it.
It did a lot for Chris O'Feely's career.
Yes, it did.
Well, is there any distinction made legally between public art, like mural art of the sort we're talking about, that if you drive by you have to see it, versus the sort that you have to choose to go to a museum to see? Are the protections any different? Is the law any different?
There's not a huge amount of difference. I mean, if work is obscene, as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court, it has no constitutional protection whatsoever, regardless of whether it's hanging in your home or whether it's on the side of a public building. you just have much greater political controversy when the artwork is visible to the public as murals that are painted on streets are. And so I think that's why a lot of these murals provoke controversy, because they are so much in people's face, which is really one of the reasons why muralists are such powerful commentators, because they have the ability to reach so many people.
How much of the controversy about public art is generated by sexual content, and how much of it is political content of the sort we've seen here?
Hard to quantify, but definitely both. Those are the two main factors. I mean, when I was talking about counties cutting off all funding for the arts, Cobb County, Georgia, which is a suburban Atlanta, very conservative area, but probably has half a million people. They were so offended by the fact that one of their community theaters was putting on a Terrence McNally play that they tried to pull the funding from the theater. And when the court said you can't pull the funding, the next year they simply cut off all public funding of the arts in that county. And that was certainly about sex. But it also has a element, because obviously the county commission viewed this as being somehow advancing a gay agenda and didn't want the public funds being spent for that purpose. But when you get political issues like immigration, when art comments on those issues, you're also going to have a lot of people who are going to get very interested. And there is that very, very powerful notion that if it's my taxpayer dollars that are being spent to support this art, I want to have some say over what it is, and I don't want it to offend my faith or my ethnicity or my people or whatever it may be. And so, that's kind of the tension that gets created when you do have public funding for the arts, is that people feel like they should have some control over what the content is.
And then it becomes something for everyone. You remember the controversy over the Vietnam Memorial Wall, because it was so non-standard and so traditional that finally there was money raised for a standard traditional piece of statuary.
Right.
In order to mollify, I guess, the people who thought the Vietnam Wall, which has since then become iconic,
Right.
to say, all right, here's your Vietnam Memorial too.
And that's a great example, because that was a publicly funded, there was a process that was very controversial, but yet the people who were tasked with choosing the design ultimately chose the design that, as you said, is turned in to be viewed as a really iconic monument, and one that is viewed on very many levels as having been a success. And so even though it was a publicly funded piece, it was very, very controversial. In the long run, it's all kind of worked out. And often that happens with public art.
The New Deal murals are the same thing.
The New Deal, the
New
WPA
Deal.
murals?
Yeah, the New Deal murals, many of the New Deal murals, and this explosion of public art, federally funded, state funded, locally funded, magnificent murals that we now all look back on through this kind of scrim of nostalgia and romance about the Depression. So post office murals, etc. We look at them now as great examples of American public art, which they are. But in the period, a lot of them get attacked because they are politically motivated. Many of them are very, very strong politically, borrowing motifs and ideas out of social realism from elsewhere and putting those to work on walls. And so they've been kind of leached, in a sense, of their political controversy 70, 80 years later. And now we all adopt them as great examples of American folk or public art.
Is that just because they've been deracinated from the politics of the moment?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's also it's America's inability to remember anything older than a decade. So the Depression.
That has its uses.
Yeah, well, the Depression, for us, the Depression seems so long ago, and it wasn't. We're talking about the Depression tonight. It was yesterday. So, but Americans generally we don't think that way.
Judy, the good news out of this is that people do care about art. They may hate a piece that's in front of them, but they care about it enough to fight about it.
Yes, that's true. But I think, what I was positing within the images that I showed was that all of these works were vetted through public process. And even in public process, what we see is that censorship takes its place through various forms. It will either be a government authority, or it will be a few police officers in the Police Protection League, or it might be an individual homeowner who will take it upon themselves. But nevertheless, I think one of the largest things that we have in terms of censorship of muralism today is the loss of public funding for murals. And also a whole generation of young people who are are beginning to lose the memory, and the very short-term memory of young people, that muralism is a place that they might find a place for self-expression. So we are having our works destroyed on the streets. We're losing that little guidebook that people come to Los Angeles with, which touted this as the mural capital of the world, is no longer accurate, nor are we the mural capital of the world. Philadelphia is. Philadelphia, a small town, is investing annually about $3 million per year to produce really wonderful works. They are works that are perhaps not as controversial because they come from a kind of official art form. Los Angeles was unique in this. During the years from 1970 on, Los Angeles did its public art process and its mural process through a private nonprofit. In other words, it was public funding put into a nonprofit group, which meant that the organization Spark, which was once part of the city of Los Angeles and then became a private nonprofit, specifically at the direction of a very smart mayor and a number of city council people who said, take it to a private process, it will become non-official art, you'll have much better chance at democracy, at a creation of a possibility of murals that will be vetted through public process. And that came about when I went to the mayor with the councilman of the 14th district has asked us to paint his portrait on the corner of 4th and Soto because he's running for office. This is a real story.
Let's see, 14th. Okay, we'll talk about who...
You can identify him.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of the muralists in the audience will identify him. So but in fact, what was possible through the private process, we could actually create panels, we could create community process, and we did a very interesting process, which gave Los Angeles a unique collection of murals. One, because we were an international city. So what is so amazing about Los Angeles is that we have murals done by Chinese artists, Thai temple painters, by Armenian painters, by African American painters and African painters, and our problems and the support of these murals was to find people who could speak Mandarin for a crew of a Chinese painter so that the artist could communicate with the painters that he was working with. So as a result, we saw people doing applications of murals that were varied and really exciting and different. And also within the context of Los Tres Grandes and within the history of Mexican muralism here in Los Angeles. So that was really what was wonderful about the murals of Los Angeles.
And for any of you who work in the big pointy building over on Spring Street, the idea that Philly could do better than us in anything is stinging. So let's get on the case.
It does really sting, yes.
Suzanne, the 1% for art, the project which has had such an effect, I think, on public art in downtown Los Angeles, has it really been as impactful as people like to think, or has it just been used to gussy up interiors and make the lobby look really nice?
I think more the latter. It certainly had some effect, but there have been ways to, so many ways of using those funds, and not all bad, but the funds could, as it turned out, be used for programming as well as for lasting artworks. And in some cases, although it's a very good thing to coordinate the art with the architecture, sometimes the money really became part of the architecture in some ways. So I think it may have had a good effect, but it's perhaps not as noticeable. I find myself really not being very aware of its ongoing impact in a really meaningful way.
But Bill, again, I think that it may be partly to do with the climate, it may be the cultural mix here, that when Judy's talking about the mural capital, whether we have ceded that title or not, that for a city where nobody has a reputation of walking, the idea of a monumental visual at an automobile level is something that has emerged from the history of this place, has it not?
Oh, sure. You pick that moment. In Luis's opening film, there's the moment where Siqueiros is standing with his team, and they're painting, they're muralizing. That's a takeoff moment in the history of art in this country. And it's not coincidental, I think, that it happens in LA. It has a lot to do with the connections to Mexico that were always fraught with tension, but also some very positive aspects about that connection in the eyes of the public in the period. And the automobility of LA starts to rise and come home to roost, really, in the late 20s. So, but by the mid-1920s, LA probably has more per capita automobiles than any city in the world. And so having a public art program or impulse that puts things at automobile level, it makes all the sense in the world. One thing to remember, though, Los Angeles may not be a particularly pedestrian place today in terms of walking and all, but in the pre-World War II period, there's always going to be suburbs outside, far-flung from Los Angeles, but in the pre-World War II period, we'd probably be right to say Los Angeles was more pedestrian-friendly than after the war, when the demographic and space explosion takes place that we're all inheritors of today.
Judy?
I think that's really an important point, because I think much of the freeway murals, many of the pieces have been planned and produced for viewing from the car. And I wanted to bring up a point about Siqueiros' work, which is that he was actually trying to invent an exterior fresco. His intention was not that it was fugitive, or that it would actually last for a short period of time. He was actually working in Portland cement with the new Proaxelina, that kind of paint, car paint, because his belief was that these were new paints, we should be modernists, we should use the newest materials. And I think the muralists are very much the same. Our intention was not that these would be works that would disappear, that they were tentative works or ephemeral works that would disappear over time. We were using the newest materials. Acrylic paint was a relatively new paint. And the application with acrylics in the West was actually a very concerted effort to create works that would last in this particular sun condition, on the particular walls that we had. And today, actually, we are in conservation techniques that will give, I think seriously, another 50 years to works that can be restored. So it is possible, with public support, to preserve some of Los Angeles' most important legacy works.
Bill?
I agree, and I would also say that in Siqueiros' moment, this point about Portland cement is really important, because we think of the modernists generally steel and glass and some wood, etc. But Portland cement, after 1900, remakes the American West.
That's right.
Portland cement is hugely important, and it's a new technique of mixing and making cement. And so Siqueiros is taking that motif and saying, I'm going to make art out of it. So it's a really critical moment.
Suzanne, is there kind of a guerrilla sense still to the idea of outdoor art, of public, that kind of almost freewheeling art? Are there artists who do both, who will do sort of classic studio kind of work and yet say, this is something I want to try, this is important enough for visual presentation purposes or my own experimental purposes to take on?
Yeah, absolutely, we do see it. We certainly see it in new media. I mean, some of the hottest artists now, Doug Aitken, who happens to live in Los Angeles, next big project is projecting, using the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the surrounding buildings as his canvas, so to speak, and projecting a whole, more than a series of images on that. So I suppose that maybe is the latest thing. I mean, in Times Square, artists do, electronic art right there for the world to see. And I think there's great interest. I mean, it must be thrilling to do that, to see your work on that kind of scale. That, of course, is definitely transitory and can be projected elsewhere. But when this all came up during my active professional lifetime, it was part of an urge. And there's never enough exhibition space for artists, ever, no matter how many galleries we have, it's never enough. And at that time, it really wasn't enough, and particularly for artists who just felt they couldn't even get in the door. This was a way, it was a very exciting way to just get rid of that barrier, and as much as anything, and the fact that it was, was outside was part of it, because you could get that audience without sending out invitations and going through all the, the usual routines.
Alonzo, I suppose you could call it the Kent Twitchell law, the 90-day notice law, that if you're going to cover up a mural, you have to give 90 days notice. How often is that violated?
Probably pretty regularly, I think. I don't think many folks know that there even are those laws. There's a California law, and there's also a federal law that try to give artists, they're not nearly as expansive as the concept of moral rights that artists have in Europe or something. but there are these provisions that you do have to give 90 days notice before, but it puts the burden on the artist, who may not always have the resources required to go in and remove the mural from wherever it was originally painted. And I don't know exactly how that is done, but I'm guessing it's not something that is inexpensive enough for a typical muralist to be able to easily afford.
It's very expensive. And it actually was proved in court as a point of contention, because there were conservators who said a mural painted on an outdoor surface is not removable. And a conservator from Zackheim and Associates went in and proved in the courtroom by compression, by actually pounding on the wall, putting a surface on it, you could remove an acrylic mural from an exterior wall, which actually made the Vera Act enforceable for muralism.
So there's something that's like silly putty that you used to press against the comments and get the comment?
It's sort of
It'd
like
be
that.
great if you could do that.
It's sort of like that. Actually, it's an amazing process. Actually, you can build a frame around the piece, use a compression by hitting the surface so that it loosens the concrete, put an adhesion on the face of it, drop it down, and then pick it up and re-adhere it in another place.
Wow.
Can be done.
Alonzo,
Expensive.
Alonzo, are the copyright laws any different for these kind of public images? I know I can't walk into LACMA and take a picture of a David Hockney and make a postcard of it. What if I did the same thing with, Afghan grandma off the Hollywood freeway?
Muralists
As
should
it
have
then
the
was.
same copyright protections for their works. You could take a photo for your own, house if you wanted to have a photo of it, but you couldn't take that and try to sell T-shirts of it or put it on prints and try to sell prints of it. I think one of the challenges, though, is, and this is probably something that others here have much more knowledge about than I would, but my sense is that muralists may not be as attuned to all of these rights as some other visual artists. And that, not knowing under the 90-day law you were talking about, I believe both the federal and state laws require the artist to maintain notice of their address.
Yes.
And if they don't do so, then the building owner or property owner actually can be excused from the obligation to track them down. And so if you're not regularly updating this address, that may be an easy out for a property owner.
Has that been used?
It is a provision that you have to follow that. And so there have been times where people have said, well, we sent a letter to this address that was there. It was 20 or 30 years old. Not surprisingly, the artist didn't get it. And that actually satisfied the requirement that the property owner give notice at the address that was given by the artist when the mural was created.
But we regularly receive notice from private owners changing building. Someone sells their building, and we hear that they want to remove a mural that has been sponsored by our organization, by Spark, with public dollars, and we notify the artist. We keep things updated. So there is a second level. But we regularly enforce copyrights. And one of the interesting things about copyrights in Los Angeles is that a kind of hallmark card of Los Angeles are the murals. So movie sets are very interested whenever they want to indicate a particular location in Los Angeles. They use the murals as a way of indicating the place. And so movie companies use the murals on a regular basis. And we've been very successful at communicating to the movie companies that payment for those works provides support to the artists, and we are able to send money back out. So people do get checks by surprise from the Social and Public Art Resource Center, be they small, but we do on a regular basis do it. And some artists actually have been very effective at enforcing their own copyrights. But the truth is that it's a long process of education in a public way, and we have been successful at that.
Bill, you talked about how, to use your term, the whitewashed Adobe metaphorically, the image of the Mexican became the Spanish grandee, the Californio, became the Charles Lummis kind of Arroyo culture. Do you expect that the unveiling of the Siqueiros mural, when it happens, knock wood, is going to spark a revival of that kind of discussion of that sliding image of the Latino, Californio, Mexicano?
I don't think so. I think that's a fairly antiquated point of view that's woven into the kind of cultural DNA of LA. The Second World War